Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation, Irrigation Smart Controllers, Going Next Level for Better Results with Richard Peirce, who's a project manager at Anthropopulous Design and Planning. Before our presentation begins, I need to go over some webinar housekeeping and other information related to the Water Authority and drought indices. So for this webinar, mics and cameras will be turned off for the duration. Speaker adjustments can be made where the arrows are shown in this part of the screen, and that will usually fix any audio issues that you are having. Meeting chat, mics, and cameras, as I mentioned, will be disabled for this webinar. And given the amount of information that's going to be covered today, it's unlikely that we will have time for questions. However, feel free to reach out to our Ask an Expert email address, and that will be listed on a subsequent slide here, so you don't need to write it down. And if you have questions regarding anything related to today's presentation or related topics, you're welcome to send a note to that email address, and one of our experts will provide a detailed response within a few days. So today, Richard is going to cover, as I mentioned, a lot of information. And just in case the presentation goes a little bit beyond 1 o'clock and you need to leave or have a hard stop at 1 o'clock, that's fine. You will still get the webinar rebate if indeed you do stay till 1 o'clock. Of course, we encourage you to stay for the webinar just in case it goes over a little bit. But if you do need to leave at 1 o'clock, you will still receive the rebate. In terms of the rebate, all of the credits will appear under the quote or so-called total adjustments line that's highlighted with a red arrow at the top. Now, rebate credits can take a while. They can take up to 3 billing cycles or about 90 days. Now, you don't need to do anything else to get your rebate. We have all of the information that we need from your webinar registration. And if you have any questions or if you don't see the rebate within 90 days or so, feel free to send an email to our Ask an Expert email address or give us a call on our rebate hotline. Now, in 2023, the Water Authority updated its drought management plan, which factors in multiple indices, including the current drought stage, which is determined by the U.S. Drought Monitor. You can see the most current map there on the right. And unfortunately, most of New Mexico is in one or another drought stages, with much of the northern part in the extreme drought stage, is indicated in the bright red. We also look at our groundwater production in relation to our goal for that year and the current gallons per capita per day, or GPCD, which is how we measure our community's water usage. All of those factors are inputted into the matrix on the left, and given those, you can see that currently we are in what is called a Water Authority Drought Advisory. Now, given that, that triggers several measures, including expanding public outreach efforts and advertising expenditures, customizing and promoting our educational materials to help raise awareness about the drought conditions. And as you all are taking advantage of today, we are hosting these drought-focused webinars, and folks that qualify can receive a $20 rebate. Now, the conservation program is taking advantage of the increased momentum, urgency, and partner messaging that's associated with the current drought in order to try to help increase awareness about our operations here at the Water Authority, so we can help to foster a deeper understanding of where our water comes from and what the Water Authority is doing in order to ensure a sustainable future water supply. Now, I'm assuming that most of you understand the Water Authority's operational processes in terms of using either San Juan Chama project water when it's available, as opposed to pumping from an aquifer, or as we like to call it, our savings account, which we are forced to rely on in times of drought and low, or in this case, no flows in the Rio Grande. Now, it's really upsetting to see the Rio Grande dry, and everyone is very concerned, but it does give us an opportunity to increase awareness when everyone is aware of how dry the conditions are, given the frightful snowpack we had this past winter. Also, I want everyone to know that the Water Authority is extremely progressive in terms of long-term planning for future water supplies. In fact, we're the only utility in the entire nation that has a 100-year sustainable water supply planning document, which we refer to as Water 2120. Now, this doesn't mean that we're going to be out of water at 100 years. It means after 100 years, we will have a sustainable water supply to work with. And every 10 years, we do an update to this plan and incorporate the latest climate models and population prediction tools. Also, we are working to ensure that our aquifer stays sustainable through projects such as aquifer storage and recovery and water conservation, which is the best thing that everyone can do to help out with this current situation. We also have several water conservation related ordinances that I'm assuming most folks are familiar with. This includes time of day ordinances where we ask that folks don't use sprinkler or spray irrigation between 11 a.m. and 7 p.m. Or if folks have water, a broken sprinkler, and there's water running down the street, we rely on all of you to help report these issues so we can follow up with a letter, a warning, and if needed, a violation. We also have an incredible amount of resources available on our website to help folks understand best landscape management practices such as irrigation and planting design. And just a few of those are listed on this slide, such as our really popular xeriscaping guide. This can be downloaded as a PDF from our website, and soon we hope to have hard copies available at local nurseries. And this contains a master plant list with details on over 600 plants. Also, I'm assuming most of you have already been to it, but in case you haven't, the 505outside.com is the Water Authority's dedicated yard and garden website, and it is the place to go to get started with information about our rebates and the efficient best landscape practices, some of which we will be discussing today. While you're on that website, please scroll to the bottom and sign up for our monthly newsletter. We have every month we have articles from local landscape experts, plant of the month and other tips, and we promise not to share your information with anyone else. And please, we just want you to be aware of and feel comfortable with reaching out to us. We are really here to work with all of our customers and provide information and suggestions about how to make your yard and its watering most efficient as possible. Now, for many people, irrigation can feel complicated and a lot of times frustrating part of landscape management. And most of us don't have the time, energy, or desire to constantly adjust irrigation schedules to maximize plant health and water efficiency. Fortunately, irrigation technology has come a really long way, and today's smart irrigation controllers have made tremendous advances in accuracy, ease of use, and affordability. These devices take much of the guesswork out of irrigation scheduling and are one of the few technologies that truly comes close to a quote, set it and forget it type of solution, with caveats that Richard will discuss today. And these devices can save water, reduce your water costs, improve landscape health, and give homeowners one less thing to worry about. So today, we're really excited to welcome Richard Peirce. He's a local planner, irrigation specialist, and landscape expert who will help us better understand how smart irrigation controllers work and why they can be such a valuable tool for Albuquerque landscapes. Now, Richard brings decades of experience working with landscapes throughout our community, from residential and commercial properties, all the way through large-scale planning projects. He has a deep understanding of what it takes to keep landscapes healthy, attractive, and water efficient in our challenging climate. Now, Richard used to be an employee at the Water Authority, and during his time here, he played a key role in developing both our irrigation efficiency guide and helped lead a pilot program that tested smart irrigation controllers for Water Authority customers. His experience gives him a unique perspective on both the technology and its real-world benefits. We feel really fortunate to have Richard with us today to share his expertise. And my hope is that by the end of this presentation, you'll have a better understanding of smart controllers and whether one might be a good fit for your landscape. So with that, Richard, thank you for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
All right. So, ideally, you now have smart controllers demystified. We are going to talk about taking it to the next level, but it was a really long title, and I prefer to make it a little shorter and to really try to help everybody on this webinar understand how controllers work, smart controllers in particular. And so Um, in this webinar, we're going to cover what I would consider fundamentals. So some basics of what is a smart controller, and we're going to talk a little more in depth into that history of why the Water Authority cares about smart controllers and really is promoting them as a good conservation tool. Go into a little more detail into how they actually work, how they come up with schedules, and then this whole concept of dialing in your smart controller. We're also going to talk about walking the line, which is a phrase we used at the Water Authority, but also when I was a landscape contractor. And that's really the easiest way to identify issues in your system. And then towards the very end, um, as part of this whole smart controller program that the Water Authority currently has, we're going to show you a chart and kind of some of the features of the most common smart controllers that are sold in the Albuquerque metro. So give you a better idea of if you're still shopping for one, if you already have one, we're also going to kind of look at how can we make it better for you. So smart controllers are weather-based irrigation controllers, and sometimes you'll hear them referred to as that. There's three types of smart controllers. There's smart controllers that strictly use historic weather data, which can be problematic, and we'll get into that in a little more detail in a future slide. There are smart controllers that take live weather data, and I say live because they're pulling in from weather stations around the area, whether that's going to be at Sunport or a personal weather station. But there's almost always a delay. So sometimes it's as much as like a 30-second delay. Sometimes it's an hour-long delay. So live is going to be in quotes. And then the most common that we see in use are ones that combine historic data and live data together to come up with the schedule. So weather data that affects a plant's watering needs is really what those controllers are pulling, and it's called ET, it's evapotranspiration, and we'll discuss that a little bit more too. Smart controllers almost always require Wi-Fi to be most effective. And then the way a smart controller at its most basic level works is it makes adjustments to the frequency and duration of watering, and it uses site conditions to make those choices, which becomes really important when we talk about dialing them in. So the weather data that it's going to be pulling in. So if you have your own weather station and you are interested in having a smart controller because you don't already have one, um, make sure that your weather station can be included in what's called the PWS or Personal Weather Station Network. And that's important because the data needs to be available for it to come in via Wi-Fi unless it is a specific weather station that is built for or manufactured for the controllers. So there are some controller companies that have weather stations as well. So from an irrigation perspective, transpiration is the water loss of a plant over time through biological processes. And the easiest way to think about that is think about it as how a plant breathes and is sweating out water. That sounds kind of gross, but that's really what's happening is it's exuding water vapor, which then creates a vacuum inside the plant, so to speak. Um, Capillary action and pulls water from the soils up through the roots to get it out to the leaves where it escapes. So evapotranspiration is plant transpiration and soil evaporation. It's important from, again, an irrigation perspective. You're not looking strictly at what the plant is doing, but also what the soil around the plant is doing, because that's where it's getting its water. So the factors that affect ET are listed there. The ones with the asterisks are the ones that are captured as weather data from weather stations. So solar gain and UV, sometimes if it's a really fancy weather station, they can figure both out. Otherwise, it's usually considered solar gain, and then the controller has an algorithm that considers the UV. Humidity, super important. Some areas that have more humidity will often require less water for plants, even though it can be super hot. Wind helps desiccate plants faster. So we might have um, fairly cool days during the summer. Not saying we do, but we could. Um, but if it's really windy, it's going to dry those plants out rather rapidly because they have that water drawn out, and the wind has a way of like physically drying the leaves. So ambient temperature, obviously today we're supposed to hit 101 in Albuquerque Metro, and so plants are going to be requiring more water when we're hot like that. So other things that affect ET are the soil type and the plant biology. So some plants are much more drought adapted than others, native plants in particular, but there are also arid adapted. You would see those in that xeriscaping guide that Amos discussed earlier. So the whole idea that we're looking at as irrigators is that you want to strictly replace the water loss through evapotranspiration. You don't want to be wasting a bunch of water that's sitting in the soil that or passes through the soil outside of the reach of the roots. And so you also want to make sure that you're applying enough water because you can apply water to plant material to keep them alive, but if they're not thriving, then they're much more susceptible to disease. We see things like that with our pines in the area where they become um, attacked by beetles. And so making sure that there's an adequate and supply of water for them to thrive is really the most important. All right, so when we consider the Wi-Fi for controllers, most of the time, so one of the things that Amos talked about was this pilot study that we did, and I'll dive into it a little further. But one of the main things that we ran into during that pilot study was we found out that some controllers work with specific types of Wi-Fi. And Wi-Fi isn't necessarily something that most of us think about generally. We've got a modem, we've got our Wi-Fi at the house, and it's working for our computers. It works for our phones, works for our TV, security system, whatever it is. But a lot of irrigation controllers, the Wi-Fi portion of them can be a little older. So there's two types of Wi-Fi that are used most often in the Albuquerque metro area. 2.4 gigahertz was the old standard. It's really great for irrigation in that the signal, because it's slower, travels further, and the signal can penetrate walls to reach outside. So you could have your Wi-Fi set up in a front room and still reach a controller in the garage or in the backyard fairly easily. So 5.0 gigahertz is becoming more standard because it is faster and it's able to handle more data at one time. The problem with that is it does not penetrate walls very well. Um, and depending on when your controller was manufactured, it may not be able to actually use 5.0 gigahertz. So it's important if you haven't invested in a controller right now to find out what type of Wi-Fi that you have at the house. And if you are looking at a controller that is able to only work on 2.4 and you've got a modem that you can set to send signals out at 2.4 and at 5, that's great. Um, you could still use that controller, but if you've had your Wi-Fi modem updated in the last 2 to 3 to maybe even 5 years, you will likely have 5.0 gigahertz, and so you need to make sure that the controller that you're purchasing is going to work with the 5.0. Otherwise, you're buying a standard controller with lots of fancy stuff that you won't be able to use. All right, so diving further into that Water Authority pilot project that we did. So it lasted from 2020 to 2024, and it was a smart controller study. Um, we investigated the ease of use and water savings, and one of the ways that we were able to understand water savings was pulling in data from what's called an AMI, which is that little hockey puck looking thing you see in the image on the left. So that is a transmitter that sends signal from your meter through satellite to the water authority, and essentially on an hour or a 2 hour cycle, it's pulling in data, so we were able to see actual usage for these. Over the course of the 4 years that the study occurred, there were 84 controllers. They were Beehive controllers specifically, which are manufactured by HydroRain/Orbit. They help sponsor the program. We reached out to the other manufacturers, and Beehive was the one that responded the most. They are sold throughout the city, so it wasn't looking at a controller that was really unusual. Um, so as part of the program, we offered, or the Water Authority offered installation, offered setup. So once it was installed, helping the homeowner or renter set up the controller, and then provided additional support for the duration of the study. So in 2021, a total of 1 million, almost 1,100,000 gallons were saved, which for the 45 participants who were active at that time was a savings of 26.3% compared to their usage the year before, which is pretty substantial. So out of that savings and out of that understanding, the Water Authority put together a new rebate program, and it really formalized this idea that smart controllers were a good investment for the Water Authority to work with. So on this page, you see the rebates. You can earn up to 25%, up to $100, including purchase and professional installation. You find it by going to the 505 outside page. You go to the rebates section, pull down residential, pull down the irrigation efficiency rebates, and it's there. So most of the time, folks assume that when we talk about smart controllers, we're talking about large controllers for multiple zones. There's actually smart controllers that work for hose bibs, and that's what's shown here in this illustration. So that is a Beehive one. One thing again to keep in mind is whether or not your Wi-Fi is compatible. So double check that. My Wi-Fi at my house was not compatible when I bought a hosebib smart controller, so I ended up needing to take it back. So diving into a little more of how a smart controller actually works, you see the image on the right is the personal weather stations available in the area where this controller, which happens to be my father-in-law's controller, is located. So again, the smart controller looks at weather data, whether it's going to be historic or live, site conditions, and those are the 5 main site conditions that most controllers look at. So some controllers will have additional. Some and you'll see the different labels. That's because for this pilot study and for the subsequent materials that are available at 505 outside, um, basically the Water Authority wanted to make sure that we were covering the best-selling um, smart controllers in the area, and so some of the controllers will call it soil type, some of them will call it soil. So that's where you've got these different labels um, and why that's important. So you'll see, if you look at that image closer, you'll see his controller's got a B, and then the one weather station that's lit up is really close. It's important to understand the how close you are to your weather station, and we'll talk about that a little bit further too. So talking about the weather data that it's using, a smart controller is going to use either historic or live or a combination. So if each manufacturer is going to have proprietary data that it's or a data set that it's pulling from, more than likely it's going to be official USDA or NOAA data. Rarely is it going to be a 30-year historic timeline based off of personal weather stations. But it could be a research weather station that they had access to and are paying for the historic weather data. For Albuquerque, majority of if it is official historic weather data, it is going to be coming from Albuquerque Sunport because it is the only official weather station for the whole metro area. So you're looking at over a 30-year average, 8.84 inches with a third of an inch of rain as an average rain event. And then you've got our historic official temperature averages listed there. So Live pulls weather data from either the area's official weather station, again, which is the Sunport, but it would be up to date usually within an hour. Or access a station that is part of that PWS. So again, my father-in-law's is less than a quarter of a mile away, so it's going to be really accurate as long as whoever is maintaining that weather station is maintaining it. So one of the things that you see the difference between a 30-year average, which is 8.84, versus last year where we had 6.71 inches, but the average storm was still a third. You'll notice in the temperatures that for the summer months, there really wasn't a big difference between our 30-year average and our averages last year until you get to November and December. So if you were looking at average temperatures in that strictly using historic data, it would have been substantially underwatering conifers during November and December because we were nearly 10 degrees hotter than the 30-year average. The other thing why it's important to not rely on strictly historic data and ideally would have access to those personal weather station network is localized events can vary greatly. So if you start pulling in data by zip code even, which is not super local, but reasonably local, you'll see huge differences between areas of the city. So I live near Altura Park or near the university, and frequently we can see rain either occurring up in the foothills that never hits us or to the west, and looks like they kind of hit the heat island that's created by all of the asphalt and concrete we have in the city. And so storms can either slide past us and travel or dump where they hit that wall of heat. So sometimes the west side actually ends up with more rain than we do in the middle of town where we're at. So those are things to keep in mind as well. So if we go back to that 26.3%, which is a really big number for a single customer to save, on outdoor watering. Again, that was the 45 participants in 2021. There was also a control group, quote unquote, and for that year, there was 165 smart controller customers who bought controllers and received rebates, but didn't get any additional support from the water authority. So out of those 165 users, they averaged 15.3% savings. So when the water authority was comparing, the one thing that they could guarantee was that additional support potentially created that 11% increase in water savings. So that support was setting up the controller and then ongoing support throughout the study. Um, Majority of the support provided, and for at least 2 years of the study, I was the individual who was providing the support. Um, the support that we provided at setup and as ongoing support, more often than not, was making adjustments to the controller's settings. So the controllers, if you assume, are plug and play. Um, with the controllers that were available in 2020 and 2021, plug and play would still give you at least 15% savings on average. But if you really wanted to dial it in and maximize, go next level, and get that extra 10 to 15%, depending on the type of things that you're watering, understanding how you can fine tune your controller becomes really important. It is important to understand that the settings work together and what they affect. So again, you're looking at a Beehive screen. This is screenshot off my phone, and it shows you all these different ways that you can adjust your Beehive controller. So again, soil types, plant types, sprinkler types, sunlight, rainfall, slope, head count. We're not going to go through each of these, but the main ones that appear in all of the best-selling ones, we will go through. And you're going to see two areas that recur, duration and frequency, but they act a little differently. So I'll try to provide, depending on the soil, like the setting, it may affect duration, but I'll explain how it affects duration so you get a better understanding of what it is you're really dealing with. So soil type, again, oftentimes the first setting that you get to adjust. Um, there's multiple types of soil and made up of components of sand, silt, and clay. Um, Pro tip number one, choose sandy loam. Just automatically assume if you are living other than on the far west side where you potentially have a much more sandy soil, a great kickoff point because the most common soil type in Albuquerque is engineered fill, and that usually qualifies as sandy loam. So your soil type is going to change how often it waters and for how long it waters, and that's based off of what the water is going to be doing when it hits the soil. So that upper image shows you that in a really sandy soil, the same amount of water is used in both. So in 15 minutes in sandy soil, you're going to hit 12 inches down. So it's traveling through that sandy soil really quickly and almost straight down. It's not spreading out to the sides very much until you build out a little more water. Whereas in a relatively clay soil, it's going to travel down slowly and spread out. So if you have really sandy soils and that's what you enter into your controller, it will choose to water more frequently. So it may actually even water every day for a tree if it feels like it really needs to do that because it wants to keep the the water like a bank account of water for lack of a better term or a pool of water in the soil um, at a certain height, and so it does all the math for you with its algorithm, and it may choose to water every day for a very short amount of time just to keep that area wet and that bank account so the tree or the shrub can pull from it when it needs to. With a clay soil, it may only water once a week. Same type of tree, totally different soil. It may decide to water substantially less frequently and for a longer period of time to build up that total water that's in the soil. Um, because if it waters for a short amount of time more frequently, it's not going to get to the depth that it needs to reach where the roots are on that tree. So second pro tip, 505outside.com and the Irrigation Efficiency Guide provides step-by-step instructions on how to help figure out what your soil type is. And it's probably the most important, like if you can only change one or two things, soil type is going to be one of the most important things to change. So the second most important is understanding your vegetation. So adjustments to this setting again change frequency and duration. And that is because this is where you help determine for the controller um, average root depth. So for cool season grass, for 3 to 4 inches in perfect growing conditions is how deep roots will normally go. So in Albuquerque, we see turf grass unless you um, have installed it really correctly and continue to aerate it frequently, like 2 to 3 times a year, um, are dethatching it when it needs it, et cetera, et cetera. You probably only have cool season turf roots that go down 2 to 3 inches. Rarely do we see 4 inches on most cool season turf. So, pro tip, cool season turf is your bluegrass, fescue, and rye. Warm season turf, Bermuda, buffalo grass, and blue grama. So your native turf grasses, the buffalo and your clump grass with the blue grama. Um, Easiest way to tell if you have a cool season or a warm season if you're not familiar with your grass is if it turns brown during dormancy over the winter, it is likely going to be a warm season. And warm season grasses in good growing conditions are going to have roots that go down much further. Bermuda grass actually has the ability to send roots down for many feet. And so that's one of the reasons if you're trying to remove Bermuda grass, it's so hard to, is because they have a really substantial and robust root system. So then annuals, pansies, etc., 2 to 4 inches, it's pretty rare for annuals, even if they're well fertilized, easy to grow in, are going to send roots down more than about 4 inches. Whereas perennials, whether they're native and adaptive or otherwise, are usually going to have root balls that go down about 8 inches. Shrubs, trees, um, there's this common misconception that trees have this massive root structure that goes down for feet and that they can reach water tables. It is very rare that a tree in the Albuquerque metro, even along in the valley, is able to reach our water table. Average water table in the valley is 12 to 18 feet these days, and other than right at the river. Um, so it is unlikely that they are going to hit the water table with their feeding roots. Most trees, and again, it's species dependent, but most trees have structural roots that never go down more than 3 feet. And those are the roots that are there to keep the tree from tipping over. The feeder roots usually just sit in the top 3 to 12 inches. Um, and so, again, rarely are they going to be hitting a major water source. And often our trees really do need to have considerable amount of irrigation, although not as much as you would expect. Um, So plant material and soil material are going to be the two that if you can only change two, those are going to be the two that you want to do. The next most important to do is going to be determining your sprinkler type. So for the purposes of smart controllers, there's really three different types. So there's spray nozzles, which are the kind that send out a fan of water and they put down the most amount of water in the shortest period of time and over a broad area with minimal control. So you can control them. You can buy adjustable, so you can dial them in to kind of get your corners. Um, but because they put out a fine fan, anytime we have wind, and it is pretty rare in Albuquerque that at some point we don't have wind or at least heavy breezes most days, um, we tend to get a lot more drift off of spray, so they're usually considered minimal control. So rotors, which you would normally see in a park, or if a golf course, or if you've got a really large turf area, you may have rotors. Much more common are rotary spray nozzles, which you'll see on the third from the right. So it's got a little blue nozzle, and then it almost looks like these streams, and they turn, making it look like kind of a rotating fan. So those put out a consistent amount of water over a longer period of time with more control. So because they put out larger water droplets, they are much less affected by wind, so they are considered to have more control than a spray nozzle. So drip, and there's really two different types of drip that we run into. Um, there's point source drip, which you see second from the left. That's a button emitter, but you could have a flag emitter. And then the other that you see, which is the far right, is the inline emitted drip line. So it acts very similar to a soaker hose, except that's a controlled amount of water with a controlled space. So if you're buying um, a 12-inch spacing, half gallon every 12 inches, um, it will be consistent across the board. Whereas a soaker hose will always have more water come out closer to the hose bib or the faucet and less water at the very end because there's no regulation throughout the soaker hose. Um, Water Authority does not recommend using adjustable microspray or Schrebler nozzles because you cannot accurately control the amount of water applied. So, because it's important to understand how much you're actually putting down, and it's important for your controller, if you're using a smart controller, um, it's going to assume, and oftentimes it'll ask you, are you using drip? And then it'll say, what's the average per hour? So it's usually 2 gallon, 4 gallon, 1 gallon. If you're using a microspray or a Schrebler, that's not going to be accurate. And so you may end up underwatering and you end up with plant death because you're using one that's adjustable. So slope. Um, Slope affects how quickly water runs off the soil surface instead of soaking into the root zone. Um, so that's important, particularly if you have spray or you have rotary nozzles. So as soon as you have a slope, even on reasonably flat areas, most of the smart controllers are automatically going to assume a cycle and soak function. So if your controller has you put in your slope, um, sometimes it's a mild slope, medium slope, steep slope, and it will have a built-in idea of how how quickly, based off of the soil and the type of plant material, how long it can run before it needs to shut off so you don't have it running all over the sidewalk or into the street. Some of the controllers will actually let you put in how many minutes it is until it runs off. So to do that, you basically have to run it manually and time it to see how long it takes for the water to run off. Majority of the controllers are shifting into that automatic decision that it figures out mathematically. So to better understand cycle and soak, there's an example where zone 3 is on a slope and it needs 15 minutes of total watering time, but it runs off after 4 minutes. So it's going to water 5 times at 3 minutes each time, with a pause in between each time for water to soak in to avoid that runoff that you see in all the images there. So um, again, it's important to make sure if you are adjusting your slope that you've got the type of sprinkler accurate as well. So if it's a drip line, rarely will they do cycle and soak unless you've got pretty heavy clay soils. So if you put in that your soil is clay, even with drip line, you'll probably get a cycle and soak if you also have a slope. Um, how it does that pause is going to depend on the brand of controller. So the Beehive, which is the one that I have the most experience with from working on the pilot project, um, we'll move on to the next zone. So if you've got 3 turf zones, it's going to start with zone 1, do its 3 minutes or its 5 minutes, whatever it is that it needs, move on to zone 2, do its cycle and soak, and then come back. So one of the things to keep in mind if you um, prefer to water like at 7 or 8 in the morning and it needs your spray needs to end by 11 o'clock in the morning to stay within compliance for the water authority's conservation during the summer. So just make sure that you're kind of backtracking enough in the setup because majority of the controllers are going to allow you to put your start time in as well. So sun exposure. Adjustments to this setting again are going to cause changes to the duration and the frequency. So the thought behind this is areas that are consistently shaded for several hours usually require less water. So the question is that it's going to ask you normally in your app or on the controller is number of hours per day that this area is shaded. Kind of pro tips along with this as you're deciding how to make your adjustments. Um, Never go out and check the condition of your yard plants between 2 o'clock in the afternoon and 7 o'clock at night during the summer. So your plants are taking a nap during that time period, and when it's really hot, presumably you and I would probably also want to be taking a nap as well. So it is much better to check and see whether or not your plants are doing well in the morning. So go somewhere between 6 and 8 in the morning. And if your plants look wilted at that point, then they are going to need additional irrigation. So good thing to keep in mind. Also, if you see a wilted plant, double check to make sure that the plant soil is too dry because a drowning plant where it's getting too much water will often look very similar to one that is suffering from too little water. They both wilt. So automatically increasing the amount of water isn't necessarily going to help. So that brings us to walking the line. And again, we just talked about whether plants wilting or not. That's one of the things that you do when you walk the line. So smart controllers are great at helping you conserve water because they create an irrigation schedule that replaces ideally just the amount of water needed to keep your plants healthy and thriving, but most of them will not help you identify other issues with your system. There are some that have add-ons. Hunter is a brand that allows you to have sensors that can pick up whether or not there's a break if it's the right sensor. So it still remains really important to consistently walk the line. And, for you, depending on what it is that's watering, That may be once a week, it may be once a month. Certainly, you want to do it at least once a season. And walking the line is really just walking the whole area when it's turned on. And one of the really lovely things about smart controllers is 90% of them have apps on your smartphone. So if you are a smartphone user, you can have an app on your phone that lets you turn on and off your controller. It will give you warnings if there's rain expected. Um, if your system is watering when it's raining, you can turn it off right there. And that's one of those lag times where the live um, data doesn't always pick up that it's raining because we get these short bursts of rain, that kind of thing. But you can do all that from your phone. So you're out in the yard, turn on the system, and not only look when you're walking around, but listen, because something like that illustration there is gonna make a different sound than when it's running normally. And if you are doing it consistently, you'll catch on to what your system normally sounds like when it's running versus when there's a problem. Um, Again, look for that wilted plant material while you're out there. If you've got a lawn, look for soft spots in the lawn when you're walking. If you suddenly sink in a little bit, there's a chance that you have a line break underneath. The other thing is if you've got patches of your turf that are suddenly a lot taller than the rest of it, more than likely you either have a sprinkler that's not coming up all the way, and so all of that water that would normally be in a bigger area is concentrated, or you've got a leak there as well. Also, if you've got gravel or mulch, like these guys have mulch in that image, you want to make sure you want to look for wet areas or where it's been pushed out of the way. So here you can see that a chunk of the mulch has been pushed out of the way where that line was broken. Uh, all right, so this gets us to the controllers that are the most often sold. So pricing changes quite a bit, and with tariffs, they've changed quite a bit just within this last year. But the Ratio 3 and the Beehive 57995 are probably the two biggest selling. They both are reasonably priced. Um, Both allow you to choose the nearest weather station for live data, which again is really important. Um, has these other adjustable and they're easy to adjust. The Orbit 57950 is was developed strictly as an indoor controller, so it may not handle full sun quite as well. Um, it also only works on the 5.0 gigahertz, and the 57995 only works on the 2.4 gigahertz. So be aware of that if you're looking. Hunter controllers are basically indestructible. Um, they're really great controllers. As of earlier this year, and I did not double check before hopping into the webinar, but at least earlier this year, um, it automatically connects to the sun port. And if you want to connect to a weather station closer to you, you have to pay a monthly subscription to be able to do that. So for some people, that's worth it. The Hunter brands are the ones that allow you to add weather stations that are specifically designed to work with hunters. They also allow you to do the other types of sensors, like flow meters, that will let you know if you have a leak or a sudden jump in water usage. So the other tricky thing with Hunter is they don't have a setting called adjustable sprinkler type, but they have you do an efficiency percentage, which functions similarly. So you can just mess with your efficiency there to dial in um, much closer. And that was it. There is a very good chance that you guys have questions about smart controllers even after this. So if you do, please get them over to the Ask an Expert. And if there's something that the Water Authority isn't able to answer, they'll reach out to me specifically. But the Water Authority staff is really conversant in the smart controllers as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it back to Amos.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard. That was an excellent presentation. Even though I am quite familiar with these devices, I learned a lot and just gained a deeper sense of knowledge from listening to all the information provided today. So thank you so much. We're really glad to have Richard to be able to contribute to a number of our resources. He gave a presentation earlier this year on irrigation and has another one later this year. So please keep your eyes out for those, and those recordings will also be available on our website. On the screen, you can see our information for reaching out to us, and we are all really eager to help our customers have efficient and healthy landscapes. So please contact us if you have any questions or you need help scheduling a consultation for your yard. Again, we have everything that we need for you to those qualified folks to receive the rebate, and you should expect to see that within about 90 days. And again, we have another 10 webinars scheduled now through the end of October. Please consider signing up for those. We have some great ones planned out. Thank you for everyone for joining, and appreciate your interest in conserving water. Bye-bye.